Since Wednesday of this week, the Social Justice Summit has been convening nightly here on campus. And we have engaged this topic of, or this challenge maybe is a better word, for redefining social justice. What is social justice? Well, I believe social justice, simply put, is changing the way that we see our environment. In this video, you saw Officer Dion, and I believe for the last 4 minutes, your minds psychologically were challenged to actually accept some different possibilities of symbols and pictures of individuals that you saw on the screen. For example, for the past 12 months or so, our news has been inundated with images of police officers that, instead of protecting civilians, have been harming them. Well, then we just showed a counter to that in the life of Officer Dion. And then we've seen individuals who are predominantly white officers on TV. Well, we just countered that as well. For Officer Dion was a black officer. And then many individuals have shown conversations of race or social justice, but have not included anything about the Lord God. Well, we just countered that as well, as Officer Dion gave pretty much all the praise to God, accepting his assignment. Social justice is all about countering the images that we see on an everyday basis that are conditioning us to think certain things about certain people. But I believe it is our task here at Andrews University to engage new symbols, new definitions, to engage new possibilities of our brother or our sister in our environment. Tonight's presentation will not fall short of that at all, but it will definitely engage you on redefining certain terms, redefining the entire discussion of race relations in the United States of America. Well, maybe not redefining it, but definitely showing you a different chapter of that long book. And so, in a very innovative and creative way, our presenters this evening will engage you and, yes, challenge you psychologically to stretch your minds, improve your thinking, and to reassess the signs and symbols that you have been shown and to redefine what they mean. Would you please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Steve Yeagley and a resident student in our graduate student program here at Andrews, Alex Angelakis. Please give a round of applause.
Okay, so let me just break it down a little bit. We're here this evening as two white men to do something white men don't typically do in public, and that's have a conversation about race. We're going to talk this evening about privilege, whiteness, racial injustice, and Adventism, and honestly see if we can come out of it alive. So we're going to get right into it. So, privilege. We hear this term a lot, and a lot of conversations that have gone on for this past year, it has come up a lot more than usual. Can you tell us what privilege is?
Well, privilege is something that we often don't see, actually, but it's there nonetheless. Peggy McIntosh called privilege the invisible knapsack because it's a set of advantages that we carry around with us, bestowed on us by society for some personal characteristic like skin color, but we take those benefits for granted. However, while my knapsack of benefits may be invisible to me, it is certainly not to those who don't share my privileged status. In fact, they can see my advantages a mile away. Some privileges, like access to good health care, are things that should be available to everybody. And if they're not, we should all be working to make them available. Other privileges, however, such as unfair housing practices, may benefit me at the expense of someone else. And that's when we have to say, I'm sorry, but I can't accept this because it's coming out of someone else's hide. So I can't always control what privileges are extended to me, but I certainly can decide how I'm going to respond to them.
Okay, so if you're here tonight, how do you know if you're privileged or not?
Well, there are some good key indicators that you might be experiencing privilege, or on the other hand, that you may be part of a marginalized group. So let's put up a few of them on the screen. First, privileged groups have greater access to power and resources, more so than marginalized groups. Privileged groups get to make all the rules and define what's normal, what's right, and marginalized groups are expected to assimilate, to go by the rules, and to just try to fit in. Privileged groups are often considered to be smarter and more competent, whereas marginalized groups, as you can see, are often seen as inferior or deficient in some way. And privileged groups really are good at being unaware of the discriminatory treatment that other groups receive. Whereas if you're part of a marginalized group, you know, you're hyper aware of the indignities and the microaggressions that people in your group experience every day. And finally, privileged groups just are given the benefit of the doubt. Yet marginalized groups often have their own truth and their own experiences questioned or even invalidated. So those are just a few examples.
So with all those examples that you gave, you're kind of saying that there's different kinds of privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. People can be privileged or marginalized around any number of different categories. I mean, just look at me, for instance. I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight. I have a doctoral degree, an administrative post here at the university. Each of these things, because of the way our society and our campus is structured, offer me advantages that others may not have.
And just so students don't know, Steve Yeagley actually just got his DMin, so now you can start calling him a doctor. So it's a term he's not used to yet, but if you get him comfortable with it. So what do you say to a person who is white but feels like they did not have a privileged life at all?
Well, yeah, it is difficult for some white people to see themselves as privileged for their skin color because, quite frankly, they've been disadvantaged and disempowered in many other ways. Perhaps they're disempowered because their family lives beneath the poverty line. They may be overlooked because they have a physical disability. I mean, they could be stigmatized because they're part of a sexual minority. These experiences of marginalization are real and significant and really should never be discounted. But on the other hand, we can't use those to deny the privileges that come with being white, nor can we use those to diminish the fact that some people are marginalized because they're not white. And the fact is that some of us are both privileged and disadvantaged all at the same time.
So I'm sure that there's a lot of white people here who have felt guilty when the subject of white privilege comes up. Is it wrong to be white and privileged? Is it wrong to be white and privileged?
Well, that's a good question, and I think we need to be honest about it. As white people, we hear the term white privilege, and our defenses immediately go up. Just because it sounds a lot like, you know, you're racist, and there's nothing you can do about it because you were born that way. And if that's what white privilege means, I suppose we'd have a right to be defensive, actually. But Jeremy Dowsett, actually, a blogger, has put up an excellent post. And he says that talk about privilege is not intended to make a moral assessment on the privileged person. It's really all about systemic imbalance. It's not saying that, you know, you're a bad person because you're white. It's saying that the system is skewed in ways that you may not have realized. And that's precisely because it's skewed in your favor. And so Jeremy uses a very helpful analogy here, actually. Recently, he started riding his bike as his main form of transportation. And he quickly discovered that roadways simply were not designed for bicycles. They were designed with automobiles in mind from the very start. And so, as a bicyclist, Jeremy started to encounter, a lot of haters out there People, drivers who'd roll down their windows and shout things out to him. Other people that would splash him, when puddles came by. Or, told him in any number of ways and with lots of colorful language that this was their road and he needed to stay off it. But for the most part, Jeremy says that people in cars were not intentionally aggressive toward him. In fact, he found that many of them were simply nice people who put him in danger all the time because they didn't see things from his perspective, but from the privileged perspective of a car on a road. Meaning that as a cyclist, he had to be constantly aware and on his guard. So Jeremy says this, he says, so the semi-driver who rushes past throwing gravel in my face isn't necessarily a bad guy. He could be in his cab listening to Christian radio and thinking about nice things he can do for his wife. But the fact that the system allows him to do those things instead of being mindful of me is a privilege that he has that I don't. So this isn't a perfect analogy, but it does a pretty good job of illustrating that this is about becoming more aware and more responsible toward those with whom we share the road. And for white people, it's just simply realizing that the road unfairly advantages us over fellow travelers. We didn't build the road system, but we do help maintain it. And the very least we could do is drive with more caution, more respect. Better yet, we could get out there and help create some new road systems with bike lanes and pedestrian paths for all kinds of travelers.
So a question that we hear a lot as students, and I've heard it quite a bit. So what do you say to those who suggest we're to have a White History Month? We have Black History Month, and always we get this feedback that, well, what about White History Month? What do you say to students or the individuals who say that's something that we should do?
I don't know, I would say bring it on. Let's have it. And this is why. Because if you're a white person who struggles like I did with why we should have a Black History Month every February, then I really think that you should learn the history of how European colonists and immigrants became white. If you understand that story, then you'll better understand the history of black people, trust me. Because they're two sides of the same coin. How I came to be white really is the story of how others came to be black.
Okay, so what is the history of whiteness then? If we're going to talk about a history, give me some examples. What is that history?
Well, this is just a thumbnail sketch, but when Europeans first came to this country, there was no unified white race. And in fact, they had spent the last several hundred years killing each other off over in Europe. So the story of white America really begins with wealthy colonists who were quickly outnumbered by their European and African servants. When these poor, non-ruling classes got tired of the way things were and began revolting in places like Jamestown, burning the whole place down, that got people, the people in charge, it got their attention. So they decided that they would divide and conquer based on the color of people's skin. They granted a system of privileges to their fellow Europeans, and they permanently enslaved those who were of African descent. And in fact, it was some of the very first slave patrols in this nation were from those lower European classes. They used one against the other. It was a system of control that maintained the power and the wealth of the few by racializing all the rest. And so as time went by, different groups were brought into this system of privilege, but not automatically. The Irish, the Italians, my wife is Italian, they had to struggle. As light-skinned immigrants, they never experienced the harsh treatment that the African slaves did, but they did experience a lot of discrimination, and only gradually were kind of brought in under the white banner. And so this is the story of white privilege. It was basically a country club with all the perks. Some people were born into it. Others were voted in, and there were others who were permanently excluded.
So would you say that's important for us to know, moving forward or trying to understand the other side, is just understanding the history of whiteness? It's important for us to know, right? It's important for us to understand, the upbringings, where we come from, and moving forward, because we can't truly understand anything until we understand, the beginnings, right?
Right.
Okay.
I know more about myself because I know that story.
Sure. So moving a little bit forward, specifically then, what are some examples of white privilege specifically?
Well, again, these aren't always easy to spot if you're white, but McIntosh actually gives a list of 50 different everyday privileges. And so I'm going to put a few up on the screen. As a white person, for instance, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I won't be followed or harassed. I can also speak about racism here tonight without having anyone see that as self-interest or self-seeking. I can buy Band-Aids in flesh color and have them actually match this color of my skin.
That's true. It's true.
And I have no difficulty if I'm going to move into a neighborhood having anybody think that I don't belong there. And finally, I can take a job without having my coworkers possibly suspect that I got there because of my race. And these are just a few examples. And if you don't think they're real, just talk with any person in the room who's not white, and they can probably give you even more examples.
And yeah, again, those are just a few, because I'm sure there's a ton more. Some of those, really hit home, especially the last one. I could take a job without having my coworkers suspect that I got it because of race.
It's happened on this campus, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't want to ask specifics or anything of the sort, but just understanding that exists still today is super important for us. Just recognizing that is, wow. Okay, so I'm just going to get a little bit more personal for you then. So what is it like for you when you were growing up? What was it like for you in your generation, I guess, growing up white?
Well, I was actually born on August 27, 1963, and that was the day before Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech on the steps of Lincoln Memorial. King spoke that day about the day when little black boys and little black girls would join hands, with little white boys and little white girls. And yet, I was raised in this sea of whiteness, really. When I leaf through the pages of Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories, they were filled with little white boys and white girls just like me. But the little black boys and little black girls were largely missing from those pages. When I looked at the Harry Anderson picture that hung over my bed, I saw the white Jesus with European features, surrounded by, again, little white boys and little white girls. And at the time, I guess I really didn't understand that anything was missing from this picture. The first time that I became aware that something wasn't right was when my father told me about the songbook. Just another example here, by the way. I read the Bible stories too. Did you know Moses was white? Miriam was white? They were all white in the Bible. Amazing. Well, we had this songbook in my home. It's called Singing Youth. It was published in 1953. And we liked it because my dad's picture was on the front cover, along with a group of other students there from Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist. Well, Review and Herald had shot this cover, except that all the students were white. And apparently someone thought, well, we should add a little diversity here. So they had the art department go in and retouch two of the students' faces in that photo. In fact, the black student standing next to my father there, yellow and the aqua, he actually became a rather well-known white conference administrator.
Wow.
So,
wow.
I guess it was at this point that, I knew that something was missing from my white Adventist world, and that not all was good in Denmark.
I want to give you the assurance, too, that for me growing up, most of the books that I came in contact with were also only one race, only white. It wasn't until I came to the church later where I recognized, wow, there's so much more diversity that I did not get exposed to, and I didn't even realize it, right? So that was your experience. I know that I didn't know any of the books that you just posted up. So what?
Oldies but goodies.
Yeah. I guess. So how do you think it's different for white students today growing up?
Well, of course, I'm not growing up as you have in the same period of time, but I think the world's dramatically changed since the 60s. First, this sea of white is diminishing in the media, on the street, and America truly is becoming multicultural. We've probably all heard that by the year 2034, we will be in a majority-minority culture. Many universities in America, including Andrews University, have already crossed that line. There is no white majority any longer. And if you're white and your identity has been tied to that majority status, that can be disconcerting. In fact, you can hear the fear, you can feel the fear in certain segments of our political discourse in this country. Like the woman who stood up at the town hall meeting after Obama's election and shouted, "I want my country back," as if white and American, were synonymous.
Wow.
Actually, I don't think I hear that kind of fear on our campus. But what I do sense is that there's this uncomfortability that many of us have when it comes to talking about race, particularly whites. I heard the president of MTV say recently, he was actually citing some research that they'd conducted on their viewers ages 14 to 24. And he said, you look at our white audience. The research said only 30% of them growing up ever talked about race.
Wow.
So that's 70% of them that are not talking about it. Half of our audience in general doesn't feel comfortable even having a conversation around race. So the question, he says, was why? And, I think that's a good question for us to be asking on our own campus. Why the discomfort for so many of us who are white? Are we afraid of saying the wrong thing? Are we afraid of stepping on a landmine? What is it? How can we get to the place where we feel that we have the language and we have the know-how to have this conversation? I don't know. I just know that white people are part of this racial dynamic that we're all in, and if we can't talk about that, then we're never going to be part of the solution.
Wow.
I think second, what I'm seeing today is that for many white students, there's this feeling, ironically, of being left out in a world where culture is often celebrated. We do it in heritage months, at food fairs, in cultural clubs here on campus. And so in 2009, The Atlantic published this article called "The End of White America." And Matt Ray, who's a sociologist at Temple University, was quoted there as saying that many of his white students are plagued by a racial identity crisis. Now, stay with me here. He says this: they don't care about socioeconomics, they care about culture. And to be white is to be culturally broke. Wow. The classic thing white students say when you ask them to talk about who they are is, "I don't have a culture." They might be privileged, they might be loaded socioeconomically, but they feel bankrupt when it comes to culture. They feel disadvantaged and they feel marginalized. They don't have a culture that's cool or oppositional. So it's like one of my colleagues told me the other day that his son asked him, "Dad, why do we have to be so white?" And so white flight today really is all about this ambivalence of wondering whether we should flee into our whiteness or we should flee from our whiteness. White is this category that is both powerful and at the same time increasingly empty. And race today is moving beyond a set of boxes to be checked. It's a challenge notion. As the number of multicultural individuals in this nation rises, so do those who check the box other. And Kip Fulbeck's Hopper Project has explored this wonderfully, if you want to look at that. So while this black-white binary still remains an important dynamic, what's happening is that we're moving more and more into a world where the dominant white center is just imploding. And this continuous spectrum of race is emerging. But on top of all of that, I have to say that there are sad and vivid reminders that some things have not changed in America. And we have the senseless killings of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and just this week, Walter Scott. I mean, how long does this have to go on? These are incidents that are jarring reminders that simply being black in this country is a life and death matter. And a whole new generation of white students out here and black students and all those in between are going to have to come together and talk about the painful and long-standing racial injustices in this country. We have to be able to have that conversation. So yeah, I would say this is a very interesting time to be growing up white. It's all about adjusting to new realities in this nation, while at the same time confronting these old problems that we just really never have dealt with in the first place.
And something that you said was actually really important is that, yeah, we've made progress, but we're certainly not there yet. That's what you said in your third point. And that's so true, is that we still see today, in 2015, that there's still things going on that just show how the system is built. Right. And also in terms of culture, it's funny, I identify much more with the culture of my best friends, the culture of my church, than I do with my culture that I was born into. Yeah. And so I can identify with that quite a bit, is that I do feel, in a sense, that I don't really have a type of foundation. You know what I mean? Like, what do I celebrate? You know what I mean? So it's tough. So we're going to move right into the church now. So how has white power and privilege played out specifically now in Adventism?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been a system of white power and privilege at work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. No matter what church leaders may tell you about mission being the reason for regional conferences existing today, there can be no doubt that separate conferences were necessary in the first place because white leadership was unwilling to integrate and to be inclusive. And that's a fact.
It's true.
And our tendency as a church is to set aside all these things that we see as intractable problems in the world and to focus on finishing the work, so that Jesus can come and solve everything for us. And that's the game we play. Listen here to the words of the General Conference president in 1944 when regional conferences were formed. He says this: "The thing for us to do is to get this work finished just as soon as we can and go to our eternal home where these racial conditions do not exist." See the escapism there? And I would ask, what is this work that we must finish? I mean, is it not also to address the racial injustices that exist among God's children? Why are we always punting to the second coming? So, if you just read Samuel London's really fine book on Seventh-day Adventists and the Civil Rights Movement, you're going to see that the church has been very slow and was very slow to do the right thing on the race issue. Just a couple of months ago, the Adventist Review ran an article, a feature on Yolanda Clark. She was an Adventist musician who ended up just behind King during his I Have a Dream speech. And so, anyways, that article celebrated Ms. Clark's accomplishments now, but the reality was then that white church leaders were actively discouraging pastors and congregations from becoming involved in the civil rights movement and showing up at marches and rallies. At the time, Clark would have been working against the advice of white leaders. But the other thing that I see in the church today is this disconnect between the diversity that we have in the church membership and in the student populations on our campus and the heavily white administration in our denomination and our institutions. This, sadly, was recently highlighted on the cover of our own Focus magazine. And another example would be a colleague of mine who returned recently from an Adventist women's conference. She said she looked out and it was a sea of black and brown faces attending, but on stage, the leadership was nearly all white. So this not only points out the need for us today to diversify our leadership going forward, but it also points to the declining participation of white people in the church in general.
So to go on with that, it's super important that we have conversations like that we continue to educate, that we continue to work against the grain that's kind of presented before us, because that's the only way that things are going to change is education, people making decisions, and start integrating those changes so that things can happen. Because if we don't do that, it looks like we're going to be stuck in this rut for however long, right? And leaving it for the next generation and for the next generation. So I don't know if anybody knows the state of North America's membership in the Adventist church, but it is only rising very, very slightly, just by a little bit. And that's only due to the immigration of people coming into the country and people joining Adventism. So what is the state then of white Adventism specifically?
Well, it's true. I mean, and I don't have any exact figures in hand, but there are really good indications that we're not doing a good job of attracting and retaining white people in the Adventist church. Last year, for instance, for the first time, the North American Division Youth and Young Adult Ministries Department called a summit on white youth and young adults. I mean, they were trying to figure out how the church could better meet their needs because they sense there's an emerging crisis there. So as privileged as white males may be in society and in our church leadership, young white males are becoming an endangered species in the pew. Black churches, I sense, are doing a much better job of involving and mentoring their young people. Immigrant churches have their own unique set of challenges going on between first, second, and third generations, but the wheels are simply coming off the white wagon in youth ministry.
Wow. So as we're kind of moving gears now, and we've talked about Adventism, we've talked about privilege, this is something that's super important. As we're talking about injustice, as we're talking about our stance as Christians, does the Bible give us any help on the issues of racism and white privilege? Is there anything that we can find from Scripture that tells us how we should get involved?
Yeah, I believe so. First, one of the things that I think cripples many white evangelicals on the race issue is their sort of Jesus and me religion. Their individualistic faith works sort of hand in glove with the central tenet of the American dream, that everyone can succeed if only they work hard enough and persevere on a personal level. Ben Carson's story, feeds this sort of narrative perfectly. But this really overlooks the fact that the playing field isn't level. There are systems of injustice that continue to disadvantage whole groups of people. And one consequence of this sort of individualistic faith is that we tend to blame people who are marginalized. We see their struggle or their lack of success as a moral failure on their part. And this is the attitude I think we can see among Jesus' disciples in John 9. They come across this blind man and they ask Jesus, who sinned? This man or his parents? In their privileged minds, one of those marginals had to be the cause, had to be to blame. But I think if anything is to blame, it's our own privilege. That's what blinds us. And in the end, this man at the margin gets it. He's the one who ends up seeing. It's the Pharisees who appeal to their, pure Mosaic roots and eventually throw this guy out of their synagogue, they're the ones that are blinded by their sense of entitlement. I think, second, conservative Christians believe the only way to change the world is through personal influence. So, just go out there and love somebody for Jesus, and that's the way we do it. There's nothing wrong with that, but again, it overlooks the unjust systems that may need to be confronted and may need to be dismantled. The temple in the Bible was supposed to be the place of God's presence, but Jesus came, and what he saw there was a system of privilege and exclusion.
Wow.
So he chased the money changers out of the temple. He declared to everyone, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll build a new one. So no sooner then had Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead than the Pharisees get nervous, and they say, the Romans are going to come, and they're going to take away this place in our temple. So they were afraid, you see, of losing their privilege. It was all tied up with that system. But when I look at the book of John, I see that Jesus is really about establishing this whole new system of inclusion. One that draws in despised Samaritans and hopeless paralytics, red-handed adulteresses, and yes, even privileged Pharisees like Nicodemus. So Jesus is really saying, I'm going to build a new temple. It's going to have plenty of rooms in it for everyone and anyone who wants to be with me. But he doesn't get there with the old structures. He establishes this new kind of community. And he in John 13, you see him bending down, and at their feet and says, let me show you what this new community looks like. So when we see Jesus' prayer for unity in John 17, which a lot of preachers go to when they want to give sort of a racial mandate, for coming together, let's all hug and sing Kumbaya, there's a path to getting there. And it includes coming to see things a lot differently than you see them now. And it includes dismantling structures and building new ones. And having the humility to lay aside your privilege and sit at somebody else's feet.
And what's interesting is just having conversations with you earlier. This story, I actually haven't ever heard it used in that context before. So it just goes to show that, sometimes we don't really recognize that things in Scripture are applying for us today. We might just see the outward external of what Jesus was doing, but there was a serious mandate that he was going. He had a mission. He was doing something specific. And I think that it's really important for us to understand is that even back then, there was still social injustice, that it's not something that, is more new. It's something that's been there from quite some time. So for the very last question, what are some very practical steps that white Adventists can become part of the dialogue on racial injustice and part of the solution as well?
Yeah. Well, I would say that coming to see what you don't yet see is a process. It takes time getting there. But I'll give you 4 quick things I think we all can do. First, I would say leave. Cross over like Jesus did into Samaria. Get into somebody else's world, somebody else's reality. Too often as white people, we tend to wait for, others to join us. And I think that we need to reverse that. We need to go join a group that doesn't look like ourselves, spend time with them regularly. Researchers have found that that's really the only way that you begin to see the world through somebody else's eyes. Second, I would say listen. Have conversations with someone different. Don't expect everything that you hear to be something that you're going to like. This isn't supposed to be comfortable. It should be civil. And we should listen to understand and then put into practice what we learn. I've been very blessed over this last decade to have some black colleagues who have listened to me and then I've listened to them and they've really taught me some valuable things. Third, I'd say learn. Don't make all your friends do the heavy lifting. Get out there and read, educate yourself, attend lectures like the one that Michelle Alexander just gave at St. Mary's in South Bend. You'll be a better conversation and action partner if you've made the effort to educate yourself on issues of race and injustice. And then finally, I would say love. And I don't say that to be trite. Jesus, in the Gospel of John, John 15, he laid this down as his prime directive: love one another. And this is never going to be easy. Really loving somebody else is hard work. And I just want to say this to the campus. You know, we've been through some difficult issues on our campus recently, and racial injustice is just one of them. And I think we just have to learn in ever deeper ways what it means to love the other, the person who is not like us. And it's a risk, but it's something that we have to do.
So how important is it then, these conversations that we're having? How important is it moving forward? Are they imperative that we continue having these conversations? We keep having these talks, these discussions. Do you see that this is the first step, the middle step, or are we on the final step?
Certainly not the final step. And if Chaplain Polite and my boss, Dr. Fainer, and others have our way, we want there to be ongoing conversations.
Amen.
We need to pick up the pace and not just talk with one another. That's very important. But we need to identify good steps that we can take to make this a safe and inclusive campus for everyone.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming out. Can we just give him a round of applause, please? Thank you so much. And I just want to give you guys a little bit of a backdrop of something that I learned recently this last year that has really caught my attention and has caused me to be more intentional about conversations about this. There's a book called Is God to Blame by Gregory Boyd. And he talks about ripple effects. And he talks about these ripple effects that we have in our life, and that most of the time we do not want to be affected by things that are not within our ripple effect. And as Christians, we are called to make sure that we don't wait until something affects us to get involved in it, but that we get involved in something before it hits our ripple because we want to care about someone else's experience in life. And so I believe that us as Christians have to continue doing this, continue having conversations about this, continue moving forward and making sure that we get involved in things that might not directly affect us, but the fact of the matter is our experience and us living and the conditions that we're living in are actually affecting others.